Take a quick focused look at the layer manager. I have opened here two different files. From one I have opened this chlorophyll product, and from the other I've opened an SST product, so they're shown in the two windows here. When I select the layer manager, I'm looking at the layers for the window that I'm viewing over here. You'll notice this bottom layer is the chlorophyll A data itself. If I choose the SST window, that changes to the SST, meaning that this list now reflects the layers involved in this window display here. The layer manager is really for controlling the presence of layers in the display, so you can hide them and show them once they are made. It can also be used to edit the appearance, but largely that is for what I'm going to call non-mask layers. So for this image, if we open up these two layer types, we find there's vector data, which is point and location data. There are no pins currently. We'll learn that in a future video. But there are several masks, but none of them are shown. I can enable them, of course, here. I can enable various masks that were the result of the chlorophyll processing. Let's add the glint process mask, excuse me. One of the things you notice here is that this purple mask of the glint is hidden by the Coast Z mask. That's because there is an implicit depth to these layers. That is, this is the topmost layer, this is below it, and the final data layer is below everything. If I hide it, I still have the layers above shown. But notice that the mod glint layer is behind the Coast Z layer. Now note, excuse me, that you can drag these layers into a new order. So I can grab this Coast Z layer and drag it down below the mod glint layer. And in fact, it's hidden behind wherever there are pixels in the mod glint mask. Okay. By default, these are set up. I can also use these up and down arrows to move a selected layer up. Okay. And by default, these are in a sort of alphabetical order here for the most part. But as you add layers, you may find it useful to bring them above one another or not. You can edit layers with this toolbar here. Now, let's just run down these tools from top to bottom. There is the ability to manually add a layer. If I click that, these are the types of resources I can use to create a new layer. Perhaps one of the more common might be an Esri shapefile, which is a polygonal file to define a region, perhaps a very specific region. There are others here that you can use as a manual add layer, but I'm not really going to go into them in particular. I can, when I have a layer that I don't want anymore, I can use this minus sign to delete it, and it's actually destroyed from the file I'm working on, so it goes away. I can edit with this third tool, which we will look at in just a second, but typically if I edit a mask layer, the options here aren't all that useful. What you're really able to do is draw a border around the entire mask, which is really the same as the entire data area in this case. So editing a mask layer is not all that useful as near as I can tell. Now this zoom tool allows you to focus in on a specific layer item. In the case of these masks, the whole image is the layers, so we don't see, it will zoom to the entire image. But if, for example, I had some pins, location points and I click this zoom tool, it will actually fill the screen with a very small region around that layer item. We'll see that again demonstrated later when we look at pins in the pin manager. As I've seen before, I can use these up and down arrows to move a selected layer above or below one another, so you can change them in the hierarchy. Again, vector data, which are points and lines, you want to draw on top of these big raster fields of pixels, which are masks, which you are going to overlay on your data layer. Down at the, you can actually elevate and kind of promote and demote them within this hierarchy, so I can move the pins out of this vector data folder if that's meaningful, but that's to allow you a little further flexibility in the actual ordering of your layers. But that's probably an obscure need. One thing that is useful is this transparency slider at the bottom. I can highlight one of these and immediately get at its transparency rather than use the mask manager to change that. So that may be useful for creating your visualization exactly the way you want it. I can enhance the transparency of that set of pixels. Now, of course, when you make color pixels transparent, you reveal the colors behind them, so you get some blending that may or may not be desirable. But just be aware that tool is there. So more useful in the layer manager as far as this editing goes are vector data and other layers that you might create. Let's go into this image. I'm going to just bring the transparency back to 0 for these two layers. And I'm going to add a lat/lon grid. Now here it creates a new layer, but you notice it puts it above the vector data. This map grid is generally going to be desired to be visible and not obscured by anything. If I were to start moving that down behind my masks, for example, you can see I can see a little of my lat/lon grid here, but these masks obscure it. That's probably not what you want, but it may be. But when I edit the grid lines, I get the quite a variety of features, parameters, and so on that I can edit. I'm just going to make my grid maybe 2.5 degrees by 2.5 degrees. I'm going to make the font size quite large. That may be too large. But I'm also going to make the line thickness exaggerated a bit. And bring its transparency also down to 0. And just, I'll close this and just zoom in, and you can see that in fact that lat/lon grid is on top of all of my other data. If I move it down in the hierarchy, it starts hiding behind things. So here it's behind this mask, but it's in front of my data. They're just sort of emphasizing that. So this edit feature is useful largely on, you'll use it when you have pins in the data that will allow you to change the color and appearance of the actual pin icons on the figure, but we'll see that later in a different video. That, I think, covers about as much of the layer manager as you should need to know. So we'll carry on in the next video with the next manager.